Enjoy your last sunset, my daughter-in-law smiled, locking me inside the burning beach house. My son stood outside, holding her hand. They thought they'd inherit my $3 billion estate, but when the fire brigade broke in, I was already gone, waiting for them at home. The moment they opened the door, their smiles disappeared when they saw. Before I tell you what happened next, if you're watching this, please hit subscribe to Her Voice. Tell me in the comments which country you're watching from. Hello, friends. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I am 61 years old, and I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Naples, Florida, surrounded by palm trees and the soft hum of the ocean in the distance. For most of my life, I have dedicated myself to my family, raising my 2 children with love and discipline while managing a successful chain of boutique hotels along the Gulf Coast. My husband passed away 10 years ago, leaving me to handle both the business and my family on my own. I never imagined that the people I had nurtured the most, the ones I trusted beyond measure, would one day turn against me in such a calculated and cruel way. It all started subtly, the small lies, the whispered complaints about my decisions, the way my son David and his wife Claire would exchange knowing glances that made me uneasy. At first, I brushed it off as overthinking, but over time, their greed became obvious. They wanted more than money. They wanted control. They wanted me out of the picture entirely. I remember the afternoon they first suggested a weekend getaway at the beach house in Fort Lauderdale. Claire smiled too perfect, her hand brushing mine in mock affection. The way she said, "Enjoy your last sunset." Ooh. It should have been a warning, but I wanted to believe that family still mattered. I remember packing lightly, knowing something was off, but never imagining the depth of their deceit. The house itself, a beautiful 2-story structure with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the Atlantic, became their stage for betrayal. As soon as I arrived, I noticed little signs, the way the locks clicked differently, the shadows moving in ways they shouldn't. And when Claire whispered again that chilling line, I understood the trap. The fire was waiting, meticulously prepared while I was inside. They believed I was helpless. They believed that greed had made them untouchable. But what they didn't know was that I had prepared for years, collecting documents, secretly recording conversations, monitoring their manipulations, and planning the perfect moment to reclaim my life and teach them a lesson they would never forget. I watched the flames consume the living room from behind a reinforced door I had installed weeks before, my heart a strange mixture of fear and triumph. David stood outside holding Claire's hand, confidence radiating from them, convinced that this weekend would be the moment they finally inherited everything I had built. I thought about every day, every sleepless night, every sacrifice I had made, and how it had led to this point. The irony that my own blood had conspired against me was bitter, but it fueled my resolve. The fire brigade sirens in the distance were perfectly timed, part of my carefully orchestrated plan. I had ensured that when they arrived, it would be too late to stop what I had already set in motion. The knowledge that I had fooled them all, that they had underestimated me because of my age and supposed vulnerability, gave me a quiet, simmering satisfaction. I thought about my life before betrayal, my younger days in Savannah, Georgia, running my first small hotel with determination and grit, how I built a career from nothing, the lessons I had learned, the resilience I had developed, all of it had prepared me for this moment. The moment where I would take back control and ensure justice in my own hands. I left the house before the fire fully spread, carefully taking the path through the sand dunes to avoid detection. Driving quietly towards St. Petersburg, where a friend had prepared a safe house for me, I watched the beach house glow from a distance. A beautiful inferno, symbolic of the destruction that greed can bring. I knew my son and Claire would panic. They would think me trapped, helpless, perhaps even gone forever. But they would soon realize their fatal mistake. They had assumed I was just a soft, elderly woman, incapable of planning, incapable of seeing through their schemes. I smiled to myself, thinking of their faces when the fire brigade finally broke in and found only emptiness. The true reward was not just survival, but the moment when they would understand that everything they had planned would fail. I recalled the countless ways they had disrespected me, the late night calls where they mocked my decisions, the hidden bank statement showing how they had siphoned funds from the business, the subtle but sharp remarks about my age and health and how I had let it simmer, collecting evidence quietly, waiting for the right time. I had spent weeks perfecting the timing, the escape route, and even planting false leads to ensure they were blinded by confidence. The night I finally left, I walked along the Florida coastline, the air salty and crisp, waves brushing against my feet, thinking about how justice was coming, not as a punishment, but as a revelation, a life lesson they could not escape: the wind carried away my whispers of triumph as I thought of the confrontation ahead, the reckoning back at home when I would reveal the truth. It was not just about money or property. It was about respect, about the value of honesty and integrity, and about showing my son and Claire that the hands they had tried to use to push me aside were the same hands that had raised them, nurtured them, and given them life. I remembered the letters I had prepared, explaining the betrayal, detailing their misdeeds, and outlining the consequences, every sentence crafted with precision, designed to pierce through arrogance and greed. I imagined the disbelief in their eyes, the way Claire's smile would falter, how David's confidence would crumble. And in that vision, I felt a profound sense of relief and vindication. I thought about the coming days, the phone calls, the legal battles, and how they would ultimately learn that nothing in life comes without accountability. As the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of years lift off my shoulders. I had survived, I had planned, and now I would execute the final act of justice. My story was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, I felt empowered, ready to reclaim not just my fortune, but my dignity, my peace, and my life. The journey ahead would be filled with tension, revelation, and emotional reckoning, but I was prepared, stronger than I had ever been. And the people who thought they had outsmarted me were about to learn the true meaning of underestimating a mother, a woman who had been wronged but never defeated. And as night fell over the Gulf Coast, I knew the first act of my revenge was already unfolding, and the world would watch as justice, patience, and courage triumphed over betrayal and greed. After the first shocking confrontation at the beach house and the initial legal actions, I realized that exposing Claire and David's schemes was only the beginning, and that true resolution would require patience and careful strategy. I returned to Naples with a mixture of relief and vigilance because I knew that greed and deceit do not disappear overnight and that they would try to regain control at any opportunity. Mornings were spent walking along the shoreline, reflecting on years of preparation, while evenings were devoted to coordinating with auditors, lawyers, and trusted board members to ensure that no loophole remained. Claire immediately tried to manipulate public perception by hiring a small PR firm in Miami to cast doubt on my credibility and portray herself as a victim while secretly attempting to influence investors and staff. David oscillated between denial and subtle attempts at reconciliation, sometimes sending messages to convince me to negotiate privately, but I documented every interaction carefully because manipulation must always be recorded. I scheduled meetings with auditors in Fort Myers and Tampa to trace all questionable transfers and shell company accounts and to document evidence of misappropriations that they had tried to. Staff who had long suspected irregularities approached me with stories of altered invoices, delayed payments, and ghost bookings. And I carefully logged every statement because these details were crucial to proving the full extent of the deception. Each meeting strengthened my resolve because I realized this was not only about reclaiming my estate, but also about protecting the livelihoods of employees who had trusted me and suffered due to Claire and David's greed. As evidence mounted, Claire intensified her attacks on social media, calling me controlling and unstable and attempting to create public doubt about my motives. I refused to engage emotionally, focusing instead on fact gathering and legal preparation. One particularly tense meeting with hotel managers revealed Claire attempting to gaslight a junior manager, but the manager calmly presented documented emails and receipts proving Claire's manipulations. And her confident mask faltered. My lawyer advised maintaining a patient and methodical approach and avoiding public statements until all audits and legal documentation were complete. I coordinated with investigators who verified every transaction, from ghost reservations to unaccounted transfers, and confirmed the existence of shell accounts that were being used to siphon funds. With airtight documentation in hand, we prepared to introduce amendments to the trust that would delay any distribution until audits were completed and ensure that misappropriated funds were returned or redirected to settle obligations. Claire and David were furious, but the clauses prevented impulsive access and legally ensured accountability. David's attempts to mediate privately were carefully recorded and his every step monitored to prevent further manipulation. I hosted structured meetings with board members to enforce ethical procedures and rebuild transparency within the hotels. And all staff were briefed on compliance measures. Over weeks, the tension between Claire and David became obvious. as their schemes were uncovered and their confidence faltered. Auditors and investigators documented every detail of their actions while I maintained calm and composed leadership. In public, I emphasized the importance of integrity, responsibility, and accountability without appearing vindictive, which helped maintain credibility with staff, guests, and community members. I continued to monitor bank accounts and financial transfers, and any suspicious activity was immediately countered with legal notifications and freezes. The hotel slowly stabilized under temporary management, with employees receiving back pay and operations becoming transparent. Every week, I walked along the Naples coastline, reflecting on the years of betrayal, the lessons in patience and vigilance, and the satisfaction of seeing justice unfold methodically and without rash decisions. Claire attempted subtle intimidation, but witnesses and staff upheld transparency measures, which frustrated her further and highlighted the difference between calculated integrity and reckless greed. David's facade of denial and charm began to crack as auditors and staff presented facts and evidence, leaving him visibly anxious and unprepared for scrutiny. The legal process moved steadily. Hearings and depositions revealed more details, and every step they attempted to regain control was anticipated and countered. I maintained detailed records and worked with the board to ensure that all decisions and transactions were transparent and documented. My revenge was no longer just about financial recovery. It was about proving that deceit and arrogance could not undermine truth and patience. As the initial fallout from the audits and hearings settled, I realized that the work was far from over and that Claire and David would continue testing boundaries. I spent early mornings reviewing every financial record and legal document, while late nights were devoted to planning the next steps and coordinating with auditors and investigators in Fort Myers and Tampa. I could not afford to let arrogance or carelessness undo months of preparation. Claire tried repeatedly to spin the narrative through social media, portraying herself as the injured party and suggesting that I was acting out of spite. I did not respond publicly because I knew that facts and evidence were far stronger than words and that patience would ultimately reveal the truth. David continued to vacillate between anger, denial, and moments of false contrition. Every message or phone call he sent was carefully logged and evaluated to ensure that any attempt at manipulation would be documented and admissible if necessary. I held structured meetings with board members and hotel managers to enforce transparency and ethical practices. And I encouraged staff to speak freely about any irregularities or suspicious activities they had witnessed. One evening, a junior manager came forward with evidence of altered invoices and misdirected payments, and presenting the documents calmly in front of Claire made her confidence waver. I realized that the strength of my revenge lay not in anger or confrontation, but in methodical preparation and the unwavering application of truth. Auditors verified ghost bookings, unaccounted transfers, and shell company accounts, and every finding was meticulously documented, ensuring that the legal net surrounding Claire and David grew tighter with each passing week. I work with investigators to trace even the smallest diversion of funds, from minor vendor overpayments to large intercompany transfers, and every detail strengthened our position. Claire's attempts to intimidate staff or influence board members only served to expose her desperation, and David's attempts at secret negotiations were countered with formal notices and carefully recorded interactions. I began coordinating with community leaders and former employees to restore trust and reassure guests that hotel operations were stable and ethical. The public perception gradually shifted as facts replaced rumor and speculation. Week after week, I walked along the Naples shoreline, reflecting on the betrayal I had endured, the patience it took to plan my revenge, and the satisfaction that came from seeing truth and accountability take their course. The hotels stabilized under temporary management, employees received back pay, and auditors continued to uncover misappropriated funds. Every victory was a reminder that justice, even if slow, was inevitable when preparation and patience were applied. Claire and David's confidence eroded further as their attempts to regain control failed. Their social media attacks became more frantic, and their once polished public image began to crack. I documented every confrontation, every attempt to manipulate, and every lie that surfaced because the strength of my revenge was in the thoroughness of the evidence. I also worked with legal counsel to ensure that the trust amendments were implemented effectively, delaying any distribution until all audits were completed and misappropriated funds were restored or redirected. David's denial turned into visible anxiety in board meetings, and Claire's aggressive tactics only highlighted their vulnerability. I maintained calm leadership, demonstrating that patience, truth, and preparation are far more powerful than impulsive anger. Each night, I reflected on the lessons learned over decades, from running small hotels in Savannah to building a chain along the Gulf Coast. I realized that my revenge was not only about reclaiming wealth, but about restoring dignity, ensuring accountability, and protecting those who had been unfairly affected. The legal process continued steadily with depositions and hearings, and every action Claire and David took to regain control was anticipated and countered through documented evidence and strategic planning. Slowly, the scales of justice began to balance, and the consequences of greed and deceit became increasingly apparent. My revenge was methodical, precise, and undeniable, leaving Claire and David facing the reality of their actions while I reclaimed control over my life, my estate, and the integrity of my family and business. The satisfaction came not from malice, but from the restoration of order and the certainty that truth and patience had won over arrogance and deception. As weeks turned into months, I continued to monitor every aspect of the hotels and the financial accounts, because Claire and David had shown that they would attempt anything to regain control. Mornings were spent reviewing bank transfers and communications, while evenings were devoted to coordinating with auditors, legal counsel, and trusted board members to ensure that every step of the process was documented and airtight. I had learned that patience and meticulous attention to detail were far more powerful than confrontation or anger. Claire tried subtly to charm former employees and investors, but every interaction was recorded and evaluated to prevent further manipulation. David continued to oscillate between false apologies and threats, neither of which had any power over me, because the foundation of my strategy was truth and evidence. I organized regular meetings with management to implement transparent procedures and reinforce compliance with ethical practices. Staff were encouraged to report irregularities and assured protection for their honesty. One afternoon, an accountant brought forward a set of falsified invoices and proof of unauthorized transfers. I presented the evidence calmly in front of Claire and David and watched as their confidence visibly crumbled. Auditors traced ghost bookings, unexplained expenses, and intercompany transfers that had been deliberately hidden. Each confirmed detail reinforced the strength of our position and tightened the legal net around their schemes. I coordinated with investigators in Orlando and Tampa to verify shell companies and trace every diverted dollar. Claire attempted to sway board members with charm and intimidation, but every tactic failed because facts and verified documentation could not be disputed. David's attempts at private negotiation were countered with formal legal notices and recorded interactions. The hotels began to stabilize under temporary management. Employees received delayed payments and back wages, and guest trust slowly returned as operations became transparent and accountable. I worked with local community leaders to communicate ethical practices and rebuild confidence in our hospitality brand. Over long evenings, I walked along Naples Beach, reflecting on the journey, the betrayal, and the satisfaction that came from seeing truth and patience prevail. I realized that my revenge was not about humiliation or anger, but about restoring order, integrity, and dignity to the family and business I had built. Claire and David's social media attacks grew more desperate and incoherent, and the contrast between their public arrogance and private panic became increasingly visible. I documented every action, every lie, and every attempt at manipulation to strengthen my legal and moral position. Amendments to the trust were implemented to prevent impulsive access to funds and ensure accountability before any distributions. David's denial gave way to visible anxiety during meetings and depositions. Claire's aggressive maneuvers were repeatedly thwarted by evidence and prepared staff. I maintained calm leadership, showing that methodical planning, integrity, and patience were far more effective than impulsive retaliation. Each night I reflected on lessons learned from decades of business experience, the importance of foresight, and the value of unwavering perseverance. The legal process moved steadily, with depositions, audits, and hearings confirming the scale of their deception. The more Claire and David tried to regain control, the more their actions exposed their greed and recklessness. Every calculated move on my part tightened the control I had regained over the hotels, staff, and financial accounts. Slowly, the public and the board began to see Claire and David not as victims, but as perpetrators of their own downfall. The methodical exposure of their schemes restored trust among employees and investors. I continued to monitor financial flows to ensure no new irregularities occurred. and the hotel's reputation strengthened as transparency and ethical practices became standard. My revenge was precise, careful, and undeniable. Leaving Claire and David to face the consequences of their greed while I reclaimed control, dignity, and peace of mind. And as I walked the coastline at sunset, I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that patience, preparation, and integrity had triumphed over deceit and arrogance. The journey was exhausting and emotionally draining, but it had restored justice and balance in a way that was both public and personal. By the time the next quarter of audits began, I understood that Claire and David were growing increasingly reckless and that their desperation would make them easier to anticipate. Mornings were spent reviewing banking statements, internal reports, and emails, while evenings were dedicated to coordinating with auditors, investigators, and trusted board members to ensure that nothing slipped through unnoticed. I had learned that the smallest detail could make the difference between exposing deceit and letting it persist. Claire continued to attempt subtle manipulation of staff and investors, sending flattering messages and veiled threats, but I had prepared every witness, every employee, and every board member for her tactics. David tried to negotiate privately, claiming remorse and seeking informal resolutions, but every conversation was recorded and logged, ensuring accountability. I held additional structured meetings with managers to reinforce transparency, compliance, and ethical standards, and staff were encouraged to report any irregularities without fear of retaliation. One day, a longtime employee approached me with evidence of backdated invoices and unauthorized adjustments to vendor payments. Presenting this calmly in front of Claire and David made their composure slip visibly. Auditors traced each transaction meticulously, uncovering a network of shell accounts, ghost bookings, and misdirected funds that have been hidden for years. I coordinated with legal counsel to freeze suspicious accounts and initiate formal investigations with banks in Tampa and Orlando. Claire attempted to sway board members through charm and intimidation, but the mounting evidence left her powerless. David's attempts at secret deals were countered with formal notices and legal documentation. The hotels gradually stabilized under temporary management. Employees received back pay and overdue compensation, and guest confidence returned as operations became transparent and accountable. I worked with local media and community leaders to restore public trust while ensuring factual reporting that highlighted ethical recovery rather than scandal. Nights were spent walking along the Naples beach, reflecting on betrayal, patience, and the satisfaction of seeing methodical truth triumph over manipulation. My revenge was not about humiliation, but about restoring order, accountability, and dignity to both family and business. Claire's social media attacks grew frantic and incoherent, exposing her desperation, while David's veneer of charm cracked under scrutiny. I maintained detailed documentation of every interaction, lie, and attempt at manipulation, which strengthened both legal and moral standing. Amendments to the trust were enforced to prevent impulsive access to funds and ensure accountability before any distribution. David's visible anxiety increased in board meetings and depositions, while Claire's aggressive maneuvers were repeatedly countered by evidence and prepared staff. I remained calm and composed, demonstrating that careful planning, integrity, and patience were more powerful than impulsive retaliation. Each day I reflected on the lessons from decades of business experience, the importance of foresight, and the value of unwavering perseverance. The legal process advanced steadily, with depositions, audits, and hearings confirming the extent of their deception. The more Claire and David tried to regain control, the more they exposed their greed and recklessness. Every calculated step on my part strengthened my control over the hotel's staff and financial account. Slowly, the public and board began to see Claire and David not as victims, but as the architects of their own downfall. Methodical exposure of their schemes restored trust among employees and investors. I continued monitoring financial flows to prevent further irregularities, and the hotel's reputation strengthened as transparency and ethical practices became standard. My revenge was precise, measured, and undeniable, leaving Claire and David to face the consequences of their greed while I reclaimed control. And as I walked the Naples coastline at sunset, I felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that patience, preparation, and integrity had triumphed over deceit and arrogance. The journey was emotionally exhausting, but had restored justice and balance in a way that was both personal and public. And I knew that the next phase would require continued vigilance, because people like Claire and David never admit defeat easily, but I had learned that truth and persistence always win in the end. The legal process began moving faster than anyone expected. Hearings were scheduled in Tampa and Miami. Every time I walked into that courtroom, I carried decades of pain and patience inside me. Claire sat on one side, dressed perfectly as always, pretending to be composed while David avoided eye contact. Their lawyers tried to paint me as an aging woman confused about finances. But the moment the auditor displayed the chain of falsified invoices, hidden accounts, and property transfers, their confidence vanished. I sat silently, my hands steady, because I already knew the outcome. Years of their deceit were finally laid bare. They had underestimated me, thinking age had made me weak, but experience had made me unbreakable. Outside the courtroom, journalists gathered. Some whispered about the shocking betrayal between mother and son, others about the empire that almost collapsed because of greed. I answered none of them. I only said, justice takes time, but it always comes. That night, back home in Naples, I stood by my living room window watching the ocean waves crash against the shore. The same waves that had nearly taken me that night. They locked me in the burning beach house. The memory returned in fragments. The smell of smoke, the sound of the lock clicking, my son's shadow outside holding her hand. I remembered thinking it would be my last breath, but somehow survival felt like destiny. The firefighters said it was a miracle how I escaped, but I never told them I had hidden the backup property key under the deck months before. Something inside me had warned that I might need it one day. Since that night, every decision had been strategic, every word measured, and every move calculated to lead to this moment. Claire and David thought they had won when they believed I died, but they did not realize that the will they expected had already been rewritten long before the fire. The fortune they wanted so badly was now sealed in a new foundation dedicated to causes they would never control. The foundation that bore my name now owned every asset they once schemed to take. It funded women-owned businesses and senior housing projects across Florida. In that courtroom, as their lies were exposed, I thought of all those women who had once been silenced, dismissed, or betrayed. I realized this was bigger than revenge. It was about every woman who had been underestimated. After the hearing ended, Claire approached me outside, her face pale and trembling, asking how I could do this to family. I looked at her calmly and said, family protects you, not tries to burn you alive. David tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. For the first time, I saw guilt in his eyes, but it was too late. Years of trust had turned to ash. As I drove home, I felt no joy, only peace. Revenge for me was not about punishment, but about clarity, about showing that justice can be silent yet powerful. Back at home, I lit a candle by the window and watched its flame flicker gently. It reminded me of the fire that once tried to destroy me and instead became the fire that lit my new beginning. The hotels were thriving again. Investors were confident. My name was no longer whispered with pity, but with respect. I had rebuilt everything they tried to steal and more. I still missed the son I had raised, but that boy had vanished long before the betrayal. What remained was a man blinded by greed and controlled by a woman who thought love could be bought with money. I learned that letting go was also a part of revenge, because holding on to hate only gives your enemies more power. In my quiet evenings, I often sat by the beach listening to the wind, thinking how strange it was that survival had become my greatest weapon. They tried to erase me, but instead I became stronger than ever before. And deep down, I knew this story was far from over, because revenge never truly ends. It simply transforms into wisdom. A few weeks after the final hearing, I started noticing small changes around the house. A black car parked across the street every night, engine running, lights off. Anonymous calls in the middle of the night. Sometimes I would answer and there would be only silence, the kind that feels colder than words. I knew it was Claire. She had lost everything, and losing control was something she couldn't accept. David, on the other hand, had gone quiet. He had moved to Miami, living in a small rented apartment away from the world that had once called him a millionaire son. I heard from one of the lawyers that Claire was trying to file an appeal, but the evidence was too strong. Her name was stained in every investor's book, her social life in ruins, her arrogance stripped bare. One evening, while sitting on my porch in Naples, I saw the black car again. This time, I walked straight toward it. The driver froze, When I tapped on the window, it rolled down slowly, and there she was, Claire, her eyes hollow, her makeup gone, her voice trembling as she said she only wanted to talk. I told her calmly that conversation was something she should have tried before setting my house on fire. She cried, saying she lost everything, that David blamed her for it all. But there was no sympathy left in me. I turned away, told her to leave before I called the police. That night I couldn't sleep. I wasn't scared, but the ache of betrayal still lived somewhere deep inside me. I sat by the window watching the waves, thinking how strange life was. The same woman who once smiled at me across dinner tables was now parked outside my home like a ghost of her own choices. Days passed and the calls stopped. The car never returned. But I knew this calm wasn't peace. It was only the silence that comes before another storm. One morning, my assistant informed me that a small property linked to Claire had been sold and the funds were transferred overseas. I knew then she was planning something desperate. I contacted my lawyer, secured my estate, and informed local authorities of potential threats. My security system was upgraded, every camera checked, every lock replaced. I had survived fire once, and I wasn't about to let darkness sneak in again. Weeks later, I received a handwritten letter, no return address. The paper smelled faintly of Claire's old perfume. Inside, she had written only one line, "Enjoy your peace while it lasts." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. I wasn't frightened. I was prepared because revenge, when left incomplete, has a way of circling back. So I began documenting everything again, every message, every movement, every whisper I heard from mutual contacts. Oh, right. I learned that David had stopped speaking to her entirely. He was trying to rebuild his life, working odd jobs, living quietly. Sometimes I wondered if there was still a small part of him that regretted it all. But regret does not undo betrayal. Late one night, I drove to the beach, the same place where it all began. The moon reflected over the calm water, and I felt a strange mix of sorrow and strength. I thought of my past life, my lost family, and how grief had turned into power. I whispered softly to the sea, saying, "I forgive, but I never forget." Forgiveness was my closure, but forgetting would never be. The next morning, the sun rose beautifully over the horizon. I made coffee, sat by the window, and smiled for the first time in years. My story wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about survival. And yet, somewhere deep inside, I knew Claire wasn't done. She was too broken to walk away. And sometimes broken people are the most dangerous ones. The following month began quietly. The hotels were running smoother than ever. The staff loyal and the investors finally relaxed. I started spending more time with the foundation team, helping small businesses led by women across Florida. Every morning, I woke early, made tea, and walked along Maples Pier as the sun painted the sky gold. For a while, I thought maybe life had finally settled. But one evening, as I returned home, I found my front door slightly open. My heart skipped. I always locked that door. Inside, the lights were on and a faint scent of that same old perfume lingered in the hallway. I called out, but no one answered. Slowly, I stepped forward. Everything looked untouched except for a single envelope placed neatly on the kitchen counter. My name was written on it in bold strokes. I opened it carefully. Inside was a photo of my beach house, the one they tried to burn me in. Across the picture, someone had written "round 2."
My hands shook for a second.
But then I took a deep breath. I wasn't the woman I used to be. Fear no longer ruled me. I called the police immediately, and within an hour, officers were at my home. They checked every corner, every camera. There were no signs of forced entry. One of the officers asked if I had enemies. I smiled faintly and said, "Just ghosts from the past." I handed them the letter, told them about Claire, and they promised to increase patrol around the area. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my living room with all the lights off, watching the moonlight spill through the windows. Every creak of the house felt louder, every shadow deeper. But instead of fear, I felt resolve. If she wanted another war, she would get one. The next morning, I called my lawyer and requested a restraining order against Claire. We submitted evidence, messages, letters, and past incidents. I also hired a private investigator to trace her movements. Within days, I got a report.
Claire was in Jacksonville?
Living under a different name, working part-time in a small cafe. She was struggling, broke, and angry. The investigator said she often spoke about revenge, about how life had been unfair. I almost felt pity for her, but pity doesn't belong to those who tried to destroy you. I knew she would come back, and I needed to be ready. So I increased security at home, installed new locks, cameras, and motion sensors. Every friend and employee who worked near me was told to stay alert. My assistant, Rachel, stayed with me most evenings just in case. Weeks passed and nothing happened. I started believing maybe Claire had given up. But one rainy night, while driving back from the foundation gala, I saw a figure standing by my gate. The headlights caught her face for a moment. It was Claire. Her eyes were wild, her clothes soaked, and she didn't move when I stopped the car. I rolled the window down slightly and asked what she wanted. She said, "You took everything, and now I have nothing left to lose." Her voice was trembling, cold, and broken. Before I could respond, she pulled something from her bag and threw it toward the car. It hit the windshield and slid down. It was another photo burned around the edges, showing my son and me at his graduation. I froze for a moment, then Claire turned and disappeared into the dark. I called the police again, filed another report, and increased protection even more. The next morning, I found the same photo placed under my doorstep, wet from the rain, with a message written on the back, "I'll see you soon." I didn't feel fear. I felt determination. She wanted chaos, but I had mastered control. I knew now that my revenge story wasn't just about justice. It was about surviving the storm again. And this time I would make sure the ending was on my terms. At night, the storm rolled over Naples. I sat alone in my living room, watching the lightning flicker across the glass. The sound of rain beating against the window felt like a heartbeat, steady and cold. For months, I had been building my revenge piece by piece. And that night, I knew the time had finally come. My lawyer had gathered every file, every recording, and every hidden transaction that proved what Claire and David had done. They thought I was weak. They thought the fire had burned away my strength, but they never understood that pain only makes a woman stronger. David hadn't come around in weeks, though I could feel his eyes on me. His silence was not guilt. It was fear. Claire, on the other hand, tried to play innocent, calling neighbors, pretending to care about my health, hoping someone would tell her what I was planning. I ignored every message, every attempt at her false concern. I wanted her to feel what I once felt, helpless, trapped, uncertain of what was coming. The next morning, I drove to the courthouse. The streets were quiet. The air smelled like rain and sea salt, and my reflection in the rearview mirror looked calmer than I had in years. My lawyer met me at the door, his eyes sharp and ready. "Everything is in place," he said, and I simply nodded. We entered the private chamber where the files were laid out, proof of their theft and deceit. The signatures, the transfers, the fake charities, it was all there, cold and undeniable. As I handed the documents to the clerk, my hands didn't tremble once. That was the moment my silence turned into fire. By noon, they received the summons. Claire's voice cracked when she called David. And though I wasn't there to see it, I could imagine his face, pale and broken, the way mine once had been. When they finally came to see me that evening, pretending they wanted peace, I opened the door with a calm smile. But she found none. I told them to sit, and for the first time in months, I saw fear on their faces. I said nothing about the papers, nothing about the case. I just talked about family, trust, and the cost of betrayal. Every word made her shift uncomfortably. Every silence cut deeper than a shout. When they left, I watched from the window as they walked to their car in silence, no words between them, only the sound of thunder rolling over the dark sky. I poured myself a cup of tea, the same blend I used to make before everything changed, and sat by the window watching the rain fall harder. They had no idea what tomorrow would bring, no idea that the same system they tried to manipulate was now turned against them. I had not only taken back my power, I had built a wall of truth so strong that no lie could break it again.
Revenge didn't need fire or fury this time. It needed patience, proof, and peace.
And as I sat there listening to the storm fade, I realized that my calm was their chaos, and that was the sweetest justice of all. The next morning, I woke to a strange calm, the kind that comes before a storm. The sky over Naples was pale gray, and the air felt heavy with something unfinished. My lawyer called early to tell me that Claire and David had both received their court notices and that the financial hearing would take place within 48 hours. I thanked him quietly and then sat at the kitchen table, staring at my cup of coffee until it went cold. It was not satisfaction I felt, it was something deeper. Something heavier. Years of betrayal had carved wounds too deep for victory to fill, but I knew this was not about winning anymore. It was about closure. Around noon, a car pulled into my driveway. I knew it was David before I looked out the window. He stood there in the rain, his shoulders slumped, his eyes red and tired. I opened the door and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he said, "Mom, I didn't know how far she'd gone." His voice trembled, and for a second, I saw the boy he once was, the boy who used to bring me flowers from the yard. But that boy was gone. I told him softly that ignorance is not innocence, and that every choice he made had a cost. He tried to explain, but I could see the truth in his eyes. He had known, maybe not everything, but enough to stop it, and he never did. I closed the door without another word, and he stood there in the rain until his car disappeared down the street. That night, I went through the last file in my drawer, a single sheet of paper that would end it all. It was a trust amendment that removed David and Claire completely, redirecting my estate to charity foundations and employees who had been loyal for decades. My lawyer had warned me that this would destroy whatever chance remained of reconciliation, but there was nothing left to save. I signed the paper slowly, my hand steady, my heart quiet. The pen felt heavy, but the weight of the past was finally lifting. The next day, news spread through the town like wildfire. The papers filed in court had exposed every hidden account, every false statement, and every stolen dollar. Claire tried to deny it publicly, but the evidence was undeniable. The press caught her outside her Miami home, her face pale, her voice shaking as she tried to defend the lies. David stayed silent, refusing interviews, avoiding cameras. Within days, the world that they had built on greed began to collapse. Their friends turned away, their businesses froze, and the life they once flaunted crumbled into dust. I watched none of it directly. I only heard about it from my lawyer, and each time he updated me, I simply nodded. There was no joy in their destruction, only balance being restored. On the third evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. The same sky that once watched me burn, now watched me heal. The same silence that once hurt, now soothed. For the first time, I understood that revenge isn't about hurting those who hurt you. It's about freeing yourself from their power. And as the wind carried the scent of salt through the air, I whispered to myself that sometimes justice doesn't scream, it simply arrives, quiet and unstoppable. Days passed quietly after the storm, but the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of endings. Naples felt different now, the streets softer, the ocean calmer, like the town itself was exhaling after holding its breath for too long. My lawyer called to tell me that the final hearing had concluded and the court had ruled in my favor completely. Claire and David's signatures were officially void, their access revoked, their names erased from the trust that they had tried to steal. The judge's voice had been steady and cold when he read the verdict, but I wasn't there to hear it. I didn't need to be. I had already let go long before the gavel fell. I spent that morning at the beach, the same one they once set on fire, the same one that tried to take my life. The sand was cool under my feet, and the waves came in slow and heavy. I watched them rise and fall, and with every wave, I felt the last pieces of anger wash away. People who passed by smiled gently, maybe sensing peace where there used to be pain. I sat there for hours, just breathing, just existing. And when I stood up, I knew that chapter was over. But destiny has a strange way of writing its own endings. That evening, a neighbor knocked on my door, breathless, saying that something had happened in town. Claire had been arrested outside a hotel in Miami, charged with fraud and obstruction, and David had turned himself in hours later. The world that they once ruled had turned against them. I listened silently, my hands folded in my lap. No shock, no celebration, only a quiet ache for what could have been if they had chosen love over greed. After the neighbor left, I walked into the study and sat by the window, staring out at the city lights flickering through the rain. The world felt both larger and smaller now, like everything had shifted and yet stayed the same. I remember the nights I spent crying for them, the days I prayed for forgiveness, and the moment I realized forgiveness doesn't always mean letting someone back into your life. Sometimes it just means wishing them peace from afar. I poured myself a glass of water and whispered into the stillness that I was done carrying their weight. My phone rang. Later that night, it was David calling from somewhere, cold and distant. His voice was hoarse, broken, and heavy with regret.
He said he never wanted it to go this far, that he wished he had protected me, not betrayed me. I let him speak.
I let him pour out everything he had kept buried, and when he stopped, I told him softly that I had already forgiven him. He cried then, quietly, the way people do when they finally face their truth. I didn't cry. I had already shed all my tears. When the call ended, I sat in silence, my heart both heavy and light. I didn't know if we would ever see each other again, but I knew that part of me would always love the son I once had, even if he no longer existed in the same form. That night, as the wind brushed against the curtains, I realized that revenge is never complete until the heart finds peace. Justice can destroy lies, but only forgiveness can heal the soul. I looked around my quiet home, the one they tried to take, the one they tried to erase me from, and felt the warmth of belonging again. Every picture on the wall, every sound in the house, every breath I took felt like a new beginning. I had walked through fire, and somehow I was still standing. The world had taken everything from me, and yet in that silence, I found myself again. Weeks passed, and the world slowly returned to rhythm. But inside me, something new had begun, a quiet peace that I had never known before. The storm that once lived in my chest was gone, replaced by stillness and soft strength. The house that once felt haunted by memories now felt alive again. The scent of jasmine from my garden drifted through the windows, and every morning I made coffee while the sun poured through the kitchen like forgiveness itself. I had built this peace brick by brick, truth by truth, and it was finally mine. People in town began to stop me at the grocery store or at the farmer's market, telling me they had heard my story, that they admired my courage. But I always smiled and told them that courage isn't loud, it's quiet. It's the moment you choose to keep living after your world burns. I knew that revenge wasn't the end of my journey. It was just the bridge I had to cross to reach myself again. One afternoon, as I walked along the Naples pier, I saw a young woman crying alone by the railing. Something about her reminded me of myself years ago, fragile, broken, unsure if life could ever feel safe again. I sat beside her without saying a word, just offering presence. And after a while, she whispered that her husband had betrayed her, that she felt lost. I told her softly that pain will always visit us, but it doesn't have to unpack and stay. I told her that strength isn't born from perfection. It's born from surviving what was meant to destroy you. Her tears slowed and she smiled faintly. And in that moment, I realized how far I had come. My story had turned from suffering into strength, from revenge into redemption. That evening, I drove home along the coast, watching the sun melt into the horizon, the same way it did the night they tried to end me. Only this time, it wasn't my last sunset. It was my first sunrise. When I reached home, the porch light was glowing softly, welcoming me back like an old friend. I walked inside, set my keys on the counter, and looked around at everything I had rebuilt. The silence was no longer painful, it was peaceful. The shadows were no longer threatening. They were soft reminders of where I'd been. I poured a cup of tea, sat near the window, and whispered to myself that I had survived every storm they sent my way. And now they were just echoes, distant and powerless. In the end, revenge didn't destroy me. It restored me. It gave me back the voice they tried to silence, the strength they tried to steal, the dignity they tried to bury. I had lost everything and somehow gained everything that mattered. My name is Georgia, and this was my story, a story of fire, betrayal, and rebirth. To every woman listening tonight, remember this: no matter how broken you feel, there's still power waiting inside you, quiet but unshakable. And one day, but to heal, because healing, my friends, is the greatest revenge of all. Thank you, my dear friends, for staying with me through this journey. If my story touched your heart, please don't forget to subscribe to Her Voice, where stories like mine come alive every week. Share your thoughts in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. And remember, every ending carries a beginning and every scar carries a story worth telling. I'll see you in the next one.